I'm Mark Ramsey. I'm talking to Patrick Reynolds. Many of you know Patrick Reynolds from his days with that logo behind you, Patrick, Ando Media. Patrick today, of course, is more than Ando Media because Ando Media is more than Ando Media. Patrick is Executive Vice President of Marketing for Triton Digital. Hello, Patrick.
Hello, Mark. How are you?
Good, Patrick. Thank you. You know, you're back from an interesting excursion abroad, and I think it's fascinating to kind of compare online radio in the U.S. to how online radio is germinating, growing, spreading abroad. Can you talk about kind of your perspective on that from the international side for the benefit of the folks in the U.S.?
Yeah, it was a very interesting trip, Mark. I spent a lot of time in Western Europe over the past sort of 10 days, and the differences in how they view both their, sort of the space that they're in, as well as the marketplace in a broader context, is really pretty interesting, and it's pretty starkly different in certain key respects to how we view things here in the U.S. I think one of the amazing things that struck me right away is there is a certain sense of collegiality among broadcasters in the EU that, frankly, you don't really see here. I don't know if you're probably aware, I'm not sure if everybody that would be listening would be aware that these guys have collaborated to make essentially kind of a universal player, so to speak. I think it's generally known as the UK player. But it would be a one player that whether you're listening to Absolute Radio or you're listening to BBC, you would activate one player and then you could switch among broadcasters essentially in this one player without having to close it and open another one. And that in and of itself is kind of interesting to me. But as these guys, oh, sorry, go ahead, Mark.
You're talking about something that I think has implications beyond the player. You're talking about people coming together on a platform. You're talking about people agreeing on a platform that for the distribution of content nationwide.
Yeah. Yeah, if you want to listen to UK content, you're going to listen to it on the same player, again, whether you're listening to BBC Absolute, UTV Radio, or whatever the case may be, you're going to listen to that on the same player.
Okay.
Yeah, so the ability to do that, and when we pressed these guys, what made you do this? Number one, they just thought, well, it makes sense. It's going to be easier for advertisers to kind of know this is the landscape that you have to operate in from a display and from an in-stream perspective. But really importantly, they thought we want to make it easy for the consumer, for the listener, which in fact would be more than a listener. It would be really just a media consumer because there's a lot of interactive stuff on there and there's a lot of good content that's not just audio. But they wanted to have a better experience for the listener, and they thought if they collaborated, they could do that more fully than if they operated independently and had separate standards. So I guess the analog that you would say is, it would be hard for me to envision the 3 or 4 or 10 largest players in the U.S. market getting together and agreeing to go to market one way with one player because that would be the best way to create a positive experience for listeners, whether they're listening to a competitor or to their own station. I don't think we're to the point yet that we'd be willing to collaborate as such.
A positive experience for listeners and for advertisers too, though, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think, this is the UK as well as here, this is still a very kind of nascent, advertising space. And they thought, well, if we really lock down what the canvas is, it's going to make it much easier to say, these are the ad units you have to work with. And if there's more standardization, I think they'll find it easier for agencies and for marketers to create content instead of all these different versions for all these different players.
Isn't the development of just this kind of standardization, though, critical for the health and vigor and development of these systems, the advertising systems going forward?
Absolutely. As a former agency person, Mark, I can tell you that small and difficult are a lethal combination. So if you want to go from small to big, please try to make it as easy as possible. If you're really big, you can kind of make it a little bit difficult, but if you're trying to get your space off the ground, the easier you make it, the quicker the adoption path among agencies. That's just kind of a fact.
Okay, great. There was a second point, too, that you talked about that you got from the international folks.
Yeah, I just thought it was quite interesting, and I don't know what to make of it. Maybe your very august audience can help suss this out for us, but I find it interesting, Mark, that there's so much of a split in the way that audience is viewed among the EU market and our market. And by that I mean there's so much geo-fencing that's gone on here in the U.S., where people are restricting their streams to be consumed only in the the 58 states. And there's a lot of reasons for that. There's certainly bandwidth implications, there are royalty implications, and so on and so forth. So it's not like it doesn't make sense to do that. However, what is it about the European market that makes their content so broadly available globally? And is there something in our system that is artificially kind of inhibiting demand out there? And will the EU market be able to capitalize on this truly global reach in a way that gives them a leg up? And by that I mean, it's perfectly simple for me to listen to the BBC in my home, which I do. They've got a lot of great content, and it's very easily accessible to me. And is it as simple for someone in London or in Madrid to access the best of American content in their home or office? And I think the answer is no, it's not. And I just wonder what it is about our system and Toto that we're thinking about restricting audience, and the EU, they're thinking about expanding audience, monetizing audience, and leveraging a global audience.
Well, let's talk about that in practical terms, and let's leave out the BBCs of the world, which are state-owned.
Sure.
What you're essentially saying is that they're abroad. It's much more common for broadcasters to want to gain audience across national lines throughout the world, because they recognize what's the point of having a digital delivery system unless it delivers digitally to whoever wants it, versus the U.S., where we gate our content because we conclude that the bandwidth is more expensive to us than our ability to monetize that content outside of the U.S., right?
Well, I think the royalties are a big part of it as well. I think in most of the EU, royalties are included to a degree. And again, I am not a lawyer, and I don't mean to speak for them, but I think a lot of their nut is covered, if you will, in their over-the-air royalties. And I think that it's a modest sum for them to be, emanating from the UK but being consumed in Sao Paulo. I don't think that's cost prohibitive for them. And I do think it might be cost prohibitive, or certainly cost complicated, to do that if it were emanating from Chicago.
Well, then what's the bottom line advice you would give to U.S. broadcasters based on your international experience with some of these folks abroad?
Well, I would say that I think it's fantastic that we are a competitive culture. We are a seek reward kind of a culture, which I think is great, and it drives a lot of innovation. So I don't want to dumb it down and homogenize it and make it kind of lowest common denominator at all. But I do think that there are ways that we can kind of collaborate in the industry to join forces, if you will, and pool resources and make a unified case to the advertising community, as one example, of why they should place their bets on streaming online audio.
So in other words, work together, develop platforms, develop standards, and come to the advertisers as a unified group, right?
Yeah, and just ask them to get more deeply engaged in the space, rather than saying, this is why you should buy my online inventory rather than my competitor's online inventory. Mm-hmm. Well, at the end of the day, if you haven't made the case that I should be buying in this space, it's really irrelevant whether I buy A or B. I have no intention of buying either, right?
Yeah, fundamentally, broadcasters need to understand that this is a new space. This is not their other space. This is a new space, and new spaces need to be nurtured, grown, developed, built, and established in order to be successful, right?
Totally agree.
All right, Patrick Reynolds, EVP Marketing for Triton Digital. Thank you so much for your time today, Patrick.
Ciao, Mark.